Hello, and welcome back to another episode of the Alliance Against Seclusion and Restraint live series. Really excited to have you here today. It's hard to believe it is already December 2021. Time is moving also quickly, as I'm sure that you can all appreciate. A little bit of background, if you're not familiar, my name is Guy Stevens. I'm the founder and executive director of the Alliance Against Seclusion and Restraint. I started the Alliance Against Seclusion and Restraint about 3 years ago, really to focus on the issue initially of restraint and seclusion that was happening in schools across the country and really beyond. Our mission became to really influence a change. We want to see a change in policy, a change in practice around the use of restraint and seclusion, but it really goes much deeper than that. Over the past couple of years, I've had an opportunity to work with a lot of amazing people, including our guests today. And really our mission has expanded into, we want to make sure that all the things that are happening to kids and individuals in the name of behavior that are punitive and that are really pushing kids down the school to prison pipeline, that there are better things that we can do. And we really want to change the things that are happening to kids in the name of behavior to better supporting all individuals. Of course, we want to see safer schools for students, teachers, and staff, but we also want to see we want to see things like this not happening in the troubled teen industry or in the medical settings as well. So a lot of work to do out there, a lot of great stuff happening. As many of you may know, the Keeping All Students Safe Act has been reintroduced. That's federal legislation that would end the use of seclusion as well as prone and supine restraint. Encourage you always to support your local legislative efforts. But let's get on to today, because I'm sure you are here excited like I am for our guest today. So today we have Julie Beem joining us. Julie is the executive director of the Attachment and Trauma Network. We'll be having a discussion about parenting, schools, and early childhood. I think you're going to really enjoy getting to meet Julie and learn about the work that they're doing at ATN. And of course, if you have questions, feel free to ask those anytime throughout the presentation. I'll be keeping my eyes open, looking for questions as they come in. So you're welcome to ask those. I do want to let you know, as always, these sessions are recorded. This is going out live right now on YouTube and Facebook, but we also make it available after the fact. You can go back to YouTube or Facebook and look at the video, or if you'd like to listen to it as a podcast, we make the audio podcast available as well. You can download that on Spotify, on Apple, or your favorite network. So with that, let me move to introducing our guest here today. So I'm going to go ahead and bring up here Julie and give Julie a wave. And let me tell you a little bit about Julie. So Julie, as I mentioned, is the executive director there at the Attachment and Trauma Network. And Julie is an experienced therapeutic parent and devoted advocate for traumatized children. Julie's been the executive director of the Attachment and Trauma Network since 2009. She works with other parenting mentors and leaders at ATN to support and educate parents about the impact of early trauma on their children's development and behavior, and the need for trauma-informed, attachment-focused interventions and strategies. So very much something that we very strongly agree with here at the Alliance Against Seclusion and Restraint. Julie also leads the planning for ATN's annual Creating Trauma-Sensitive Schools Conference, which we'll talk about a little bit later today. And Julie frequently presents workshops on whole brain, wholehearted approaches to therapeutic parenting, as well as co-hosting ATN's Regulated and Relational podcast. And I was telling Julie as we were getting started here, I'm like, I'd love to have you come back and maybe share one of those presentations with us in the future. Julie also frequently writes articles and blogs about parenting, schools, and early childhood trauma, as well as a chapter on educating internationally adopted children in the EMK Press Adoption Parenting book. And that's really interesting. One of the things that I've seen through some of the work I've been doing, especially with a lot of survivors in the troubled teen industry, is some connection between children that have been adopted internationally and traumatic experiences and behavior issues that have landed them in placements that have done a lot of harm. So I'd love to hear more about that as we talk. But with that introduction, Julie, it is so nice to have you here today. Really excited to have had the opportunity to get to meet you previously and to have you here joining our audience. So welcome.
Thank you, Guy. It's great to be here. We over at the Attachment and Trauma Network really appreciate the work that you all are doing because it is a problem. Restraint and seclusion in schools and other places is a true problem. And a lot of the members and the longtime volunteers of the Attachment and Trauma Network are parents of children who've had significant trauma, developmental trauma impacts. And so we have stories that align very closely with a lot of the stories of the people that you represent. So glad to be here.
Absolutely. And it's been a really interesting journey kind of doing this work, but it's been so amazing and helpful to be able to come together with other like-minded organizations and individuals, like ATN, and know that there's people out there doing amazing work and coming together to try to do things to influence a change. So it's an honor to get to work alongside you and so many others that are doing this work. But let's start off at the top if we can. And can you tell us and our viewers a little bit about what is the Attachment and Trauma Network?
Well, initially, the Attachment and Trauma Network, which is over 26 years old at this point, was founded by parents, by a mom and a group of mothers actually in Kansas City, Missouri, who were looking to support each other. They were all adoptive or foster parents, and their children had diagnoses that in the early and mid 90s was probably oppositional defiance or reactive attachment disorder. And so their therapists encouraged them to talk to each other about what was working in terms of parent strategies. So they were go-getter moms and dads, and they did as much research as they could do. And before long, people outside of Kansas City started to recognize, that they had some answers, that they had some information, and they would pull in speakers from various parts of the country if they could find them. This was all pre-internet. So when my husband and I added our fourth child to our family through international adoption, and when she came home to us, she was almost 2, she was 19 months. And she was not at all like any 2-year-old that we'd ever met. And we quickly exhausted our local professional resources in terms of what's happening here, what's going on, why is this, are these behaviors occurring, what's happening. And it was through networking that I stumbled across this group of folks where the founder was spending most of her days on the phone, just trying to support families, find them local therapists and local places to get answers. And the word trauma wasn't there at all. It just didn't exist. Right. So because what I was learning from these other parents was working for us, I was trying to give back as we struggled through trying to figure out what we now know in many cases is developmental trauma disorder, what that was looking like in our families. And so I literally had to give up my job, my career, in order to stay at home and focus on her needs and her therapeutic needs, but started giving back through ATN. So when Nancy decided that it was time for her to retire, she's like, how about you? I was like, okay. And of course it was, and you can probably relate to this, it was all volunteer. I mean, we were just doing it. We were doing it in our basements. We were doing it in our evenings and on our weekends. And our children were licking envelopes. It was like whatever it took. Right. So that happened for a good long time. And then, the words that trauma started coming along and the neuroscience started coming along. So we really had watched it happen, and ate it up as fast as we could get it. That we were before Bruce Perry and Bessel van der Kolk. They were doing their work, but we didn't know that. Right. And so it was just like, oh yes, do we have case studies for you? And, that type of thing. So it was that beginning. And then before long, some of our members started coming to us with, we're parents, but we're also educators, and we're principals or counselors or all of these different fields. And we're trying what we're learning through all of the things that we're talking about and the webinars that we're doing and the speakers that we're having. And it's working. It's working in our classrooms. It's working with some of our kids who've been the hardest to figure out what their behaviors are doing. And so that was the biggest next need. Our families were saying, once we get this figured out, we can't convince the schools,
Mhm,
that
mhm, mhm.
that we do know what we're talking about and that
Right.
it's working, or we don't know what to ask for in the schools, and we don't know how to make that work. So this group of parents who were also educators started collaborating on what can we do,
Mhm.
and we started reaching out and discovering that there were pockets of really brilliant people across the country who didn't really even know about each other,
Mhm.
but were working on trauma-informed education, even if they didn't call it that.
Right.
And we started sort of just networking it, which is why the Attachment Trauma Network, the network part of the name, is really important. We just started networking those people together. We said, let's have an audio summit. Let's talk about these issues. So in a lot of ways, similar to what you and I are doing today,
Mhm.
that has been one of the main functions of ATN, is to sort of be that communicator and that megaphone, and that let's all talk about it, and let's collect the
Mhm.
information, and let's have it available for people. And within the last 5 years, the desire and the interest in knowing about trauma-informed information, of course, has skyrocketed.
Right.
It's everywhere, right? And that's it's both good and bad. The bad part is that maybe people don't know exactly what they're talking about,
Right.
or exactly what it means. But the good, I mean, we're just like, oh, thank you. Finally, people are hearing this. So in 2019, we had our first Creating Trauma Sensitive Schools conference, and I figured we would bankrupt what little nest egg we had, but we didn't. We had almost 700 educators, and then every year since then, the attendance has nearly doubled. Last year was kind of an anomaly because we had to do it all virtually, but it all
Mhm, mhm.
held steady. And this year, it's going to double or more again. We already know that. So it's information that that folks need, and it's really gratifying to think all of these years, as I tell my staff all the time, that we spent crying in the wilderness. Finally, people are making a difference in children's lives in using the information that we had to search so much for.
Mhm,
So
mhm, mhm.
that's it, really. I mean, that's the history of ATN and where we've come from.
That's good. That's fantastic. And I hear you on feeling feeling that sense of probably relief and that people are beginning to understand the impact of trauma. And though we're not there yet, we're at that point where we're still struggling between, and this is my perception. You can tell me if you think differently, but um, the idea has gained a lot of traction. People are beginning to take it seriously in terms of the impact, and we're seeing training. I think the challenge here is to make sure that when we're thinking about trauma informed approaches, when we're thinking about what we can do to transform our parenting or our educational environments, it's not just a checklist of things to check that
Right.
you've done.
Exactly.
It's really about kind of changing the culture. And one of the concerns that I have is that I've seen where a school has a half day training on being trauma informed and then considers themselves to be trauma informed.
Right.
It's so much more than that to really change the approach. So why don't we talk a little bit about, from your perspective, what does it mean? I mean, again, you hear the word a lot now, trauma informed or trauma sensitive. What does it mean to be trauma informed? And from your perspective, what does that mean?
Sure. At ATN, we hang pretty close to what the SAMHSA folks, what their basic definitions are of trauma informed care, and we explain it by talking about the 4 R's that they have in terms of recognizing the trauma, recognizing what trauma is, realizing the prevalence. Oh, you're going to put me on the spot, Guy. What are they? Um,
Well,
uh, the last one is to avoid re-traumatization, but there's a very important step in there. Oh gosh.
well, and I always revert to my own R's, which are easier to remember. I often joke that there's 3 R's in education, which are relationship, relationship, relationship.
Yes.
So that's the point
Well,
that's easy, an
it
easier to
it
remember
is.
list.
And really what it boils down to, as we talk about, and the reason that we named our podcast Regulated and Relational, is that the cornerstones of of helping children to overcome trauma, which is the goal of being trauma informed, right?
Mhm,
Is to help them have better regulation skills and to be relational with them, which is that, and those things are in concert with each other. In other words, when you are relational, when you have created a solid relationship with a child, that helps their nervous systems to regulate, that helps them to learn regulation tools when they start to feel dysregulated. That's how we all learned it, right? That was when I was, I was a parent, as attachment theorists would say, a good enough parent to my biological children before we adopted. And yet I didn't understand that I was teaching them how to regulate. Nobody said, oh, well, the way you take care of your infant is developing a relationship with them that is going to make it easier for them to be able to regulate when hard things come, and it's going to make them more resilient. Nobody used those words with me, but the truth was that's exactly what I was doing, right? So children who don't have that early on, or have it disrupted because of some adversity, whatever that adversity is, that ACE, or that, that whatever tragic or traumatic thing that happens, they miss the developmental window of that happening in that early relationship. So it has to happen someplace else. And if someone had told me early on that I had to actively teach my child to regulate, and that one way to do that was through relationship, and another way was through all kinds of other biological tools and things that I could use, my life would have been so much easier with her from the get-go. We had to, it took us years to learn that was what was needed, even, and to sort of ferret out, why are the behaviors what they are. But that's, trauma-informed care is really simple on the surface and really difficult in practice, because it's an entire mind shift. It's an entire paradigm shift of what we typically believe about children and how they learn, about behaviors and where they come from and what they mean and what we should do about them, all of those things. And it's hard for me to even shift backwards now, like when I'm leading a book study on Bruce Perry's book. It's one of several that we've done, but it's always surprising to me when other adults are like, so you mean that the earlier the trauma happened to a child, the more impactful it was? I mean, it's like a light bulb goes off in their heads, because I'm like, yeah, because the less you have, the less resilience you have built, the less relationship you have to fall back on. You don't know the world's a safe place because you haven't had that safe relational nurturing to be able to fall back on. And so it makes sense once you know it, but you really have to, you have to allow yourself to shift your paradigm, and to shift your paradigm about behaviors to, it's like when we're parents, we want to focus on a behavior as whether it's a good behavior or a bad behavior, and we want to stop it if it's a bad behavior, right? Instead of saying, okay, if behavior is communication, what is my child trying to tell me? What is this child trying to communicate and can't communicate in other, in socially acceptable ways, that they're starting to get dysregulated? What's causing them this overwhelmed or making this?
Absolutely. And looking beyond volitional choice, not every behavior is a matter of choice. And, we see again and again, 5, 6, 7-year-olds who haven't even necessarily developed the developmental capacity to self-regulate, or to do things that are expected of them. And people look at them as if everything they do is a matter of choice. And, I found it really interesting, kind of looking at Bruce Perry's work and others, but of how important that first 18 months is, for example. That was really shocking to me initially, and again, it makes sense. And we've been bombarded sometimes, I think, with bad messaging about parenting. I think about some of the common ideologies that have been out there, like, well, they need to cry it out, they need, and there are so many things. The fact that we still have a pretty pervasive issue around corporal punishment happening in both schools and in families, and
parenting,
the impact that has on very young children. So I found that really fascinating. And of course, it gets into the attachment piece of this. So we have a better understanding. I think people broadly, through the work of the Adverse Childhood Experiences Study, through a lot more awareness about trauma-informed approaches, have more understanding about kind of the trauma piece. But let's talk about the attachment piece. So when you say attachment, what do you mean by attachment, and why is that so critical?
The basis of attachment obviously is that early first relationship that you have, that primary relationship you have with your caregiver. Typically for most of us, especially if we have healthy attachment, it was the person who gave birth to us, or the couple who gave birth to us, or it's usually the mom. I mean, quite frankly, it doesn't have to be. It can be any number of people who serve that relationship. So it's the glue. It's that, we just flat out say attachment is the antidote for the trauma. It's what is needed. We have to understand. In Bruce Perry's book, he doesn't use the word attachment. He talks about love a lot, and love is a good way to look at that. If you don't understand the attachment theory language, which isn't necessarily, parents don't, but professionals often do. It's the piece that can easily be missing in a child's early experience for any one of those ACEs reasons. If you've lost your primary caregiver, if you've been in the hospital, or your primary caregiver has been in the hospital, if you have a primary caregiver who isn't able to care for you because they have an addiction or a mental illness, or they're incarcerated, or all of those things that, if you look at the ACEs, if those things happen, you are at significant risk of not getting that early attachment relationship that you need. And the power of that relationship is around how it sets your view of the world and your view of yourself. And we're talking about pre-verbal, so embedded in your brain that you might not even be able as an adult to articulate it without working through in some therapeutic way to understand that this is who you are. That you either are going to, if you have good enough attachment, you're either going to feel like the world is basically a safe place, and you're going to give most people the benefit of the doubt because they're safe people, and that you have some power over what happens to you in the world, that you matter, that you're able to make a difference, and that that you have worth, and that if you need help, you can ask for it and you can get it. That happens when things are healthy. When things aren't healthy, it skews the complete opposite. The world is not a safe place. I can't trust folks. I can't depend on anybody but me. I'm not going to ask for help. I don't know if I matter to anybody. I don't, all of those things. And that might sound really far-fetched to you if you're just hearing that for the first time. But as I was reading it, as a mother of a child who was sitting in front of me, I went, oh my gosh, that's exactly what's happening for her. That was different than my other children, because they were willing to take a chance on things. So things come up in like a way a child would approach school. I mean, my other children were ready to attempt anything that a teacher asked them to do. Try to spell this word, whatever it is, because the failure of not getting that right wasn't an absolute failure of who they were. It was just a mistake, and they knew that they could go on. But internally, my daughter's internal view of herself was so fragile because she didn't have that early attachment piece and that buildup, that she wouldn't or couldn't, or it was just too overwhelming for her to try. Does that make sense?
Absolutely makes sense. And safety, the sense of safety, is foundational. If you don't feel safe, you can't learn. You can't necessarily even fulfill some of the functions that you might otherwise be able to fulfill if you don't feel safe and secure. And of course, we see that happening. What happens when you don't feel safe? People that have been through trauma, they then become hypervigilant. They become from a mindset of waiting for something to go wrong or waiting for something bad to happen. And of course, that sense then leads to a higher instance of distress-related behaviors. Even down the road, I mean, when I think about very young kids, I'm thinking about, behaviors that might be disruptive in a class, but, as kids get older, it could be addiction or other types of things due to
Exactly.
that lack of safety. And you're right, people very often are very dismissive, especially of very early experiences. I mean, the fact that you may not have memory of being below 18 months doesn't mean that your brain wasn't, connections in your brain, foundational connections that weren't made during that time are very, very influential. And, sometimes you hear things, when it comes to trauma, like, well, this happened to me, that happened to me. So, and I'm okay. Right. How do you,
Right.
handle that? Because I mean, certainly that's something that we hear sometimes is
Well,
people
and
can be dismissive.
I handle it with much of the same description that Dr. Perry uses in his book, is that what happens to you, like the experience of the trauma
Right.
isn't going to impact us all the same. I mean, if
Right.
something happened right now to the two of us, Guy, you and I would both respond and react and have an experience that was different than each other, depending on so many factors, right? So our history, our genetics, our attachment, all of those things, right? That play into that. So that's, yeah. And living in the international adoption world, initially that conversation was like, well, we adopted a child from China and she didn't have any problems. We don't understand what your problem is, right? It's like, well, that's not even valid, because that's like, it's like saying, well, we had a car wreck and we didn't get a broken leg, and it's like, well, okay, well,
That's
I
a
had a
great
car wreck and
example.
I did get a broken leg. So
Right.
there, right.
Right.
It's
Y- Yeah.
I mean,
So that's interesting, bringing up, and I mentioned this as we were introducing you, but, I think about adoption, foster care, systems, that people may be in that, um, one of the things that we see is that kids that are having more punitive things happen to them, restraint, seclusion, suspension, expulsion, corporal punishment, or even ending up in a kind of a troubled teen facility, regardless of the pathway there, we see a very large representation of people that have been adopted or been through the foster care. Um, and I think you've kind of explained that, but can you talk a little bit more about that?
sure.
And
That primal wound, that primary
right.
loss,
Hmm.
right, is significant, and it puts a child at significant risk. That doesn't mean I'm anti-adoption to say those words at all. That, in fact, adopting a child who is at risk like that is one of the most important things you can do for them, right? But equipping the adoptive and foster families with that therapeutic knowledge of what that means, of what to look for and how to address it in a wholehearted, whole brain way is really crucial, right? Because they're coming at the most significant risk. And I think what you see what you see are situations where maybe those families didn't get the resources and the knowledge that they needed, because we didn't have that. And so I know how difficult that has been to find. As of late, I think adoption agencies and foster agencies are doing a better job. And it's not that they're doing the best job, and it's not that there's not room for improvement, but they're doing a better job of introducing the ideas of, here's, this is what trauma looks like. This is what attachment is needed. They're teaching that information. And yet it's hard, because some parents are super open to hearing that and understanding that, and some are not. And so then you've got the whole, but we at ATN truly believe that every child who's gone through an adoption has a wound, has that attachment, that primary wound. Now, some children, just like the car wreck, some children don't break their leg because of that wound, and they can just go on about their lives, and their family situations are really positive, and they don't have problems. But a lot of them are at greater risk of breaking their leg, right? In many situations. And sometimes it's not at first. Sometimes it's when they start school. Sometimes it's when they hit the teen years or the young adult years, and they're trying to like become independent from their family, and that whole pull away thing becomes. And so that's a lot of why we see that population in those teen programs a lot of times, is that things go way, way far out of.
So you said something really interesting that kind of triggered a thought, and the thought is one that I have frequently when I look at the issues that we're concerned about here at the Alliance, and of course we're very supportive of kind of the trauma informed approaches and neuroscience aligned approaches and all of that. But the interesting thing is we continue to need to go further upstream. So it's not just about being trauma informed, but it's how do we improve the situation for parents that might be otherwise in a situation that is very difficult for bringing a newborn child into the world. How do we better support young families and parents, and how do we better educate people? Again, there's anybody that's ever had a child can relate to whether natural or through adoption, can relate to the rush of advice you get from many different directions about parenting. And I would continue to say that there's a lot of well-intentioned but very bad advice out there that people get, but it seems that there's this greater need upstream to educate people about trauma and attachment, to really try to provide for families. And so what are your thoughts on that? How can we not only be reacting to the trauma, but how can we more proactively try to get at some of those issues?
It's so important, Guy. It is the essential question, I think, at this point for us as a society,
Right.
is what are we going to do to support the development of healthy children by supporting their parents at the beginning. I mean, and Perry's work makes it really clear. Those first 2 months are critical.
Right.
And I came back from Chicago. I'm a grandmother again. So
Congratulations.
From spending 2 weeks with my daughter and her newborn daughter. So exciting and exhausting. And I was there, and her husband was there. He had a week of leave, and then he had to go back to work. And so I was there during all of that transition. And sometimes I was the third wheel, and sometimes I was second in charge. And the whole experience was fun and blessed and all of these things, but it was exhausting. And I kept thinking, what happens to the parents, to the moms that don't have all of this safety net? She had her husband, she had me, she had the resources to get whatever she needed for this child. And still was, emotionally spent, physically exhausted, all of the things you are with a newborn, to the point that, and looking for, she's well-read, college educated young woman. And yet she needed somebody to tell her, what to do sometimes and to help and all of those things. And so if you don't have the social network and you don't have the means to get that, then you and your child are much more at risk. And we in this country, from a systemic standpoint, don't really make a way for those children and those families. And so already, the stress of the mother becomes the stress of the baby. And already we're setting that up for. So I don't, I can't even begin to solve that problem here, but it is the problem, it's the problem we need to try to solve as much as possible. And I know there are lots of good nonprofits that are trying to do that in various local places here in Atlanta. I know of several that are doing that, but it's still not enough. It's a little like spitting in the ocean, right?
Yeah. And I mean, this just goes to show the ongoing need for awareness. I mean, some of it begins with awareness, and of course, your daughter's very lucky to have Julie Beem as a grandmother. I mean, you've got knowledge and background and experience. I was thinking, you were talking about this, I was thinking about how if I could go back and do it all again and know the things that I know now, the things that I might change. And we all learn along the way. And certainly I learned in my journey. I tried to be educated before we went on that journey. But
me
still
too.
Followed some bad advice and some things that I wish we hadn't done. I have, a great family and two fantastic kids, but, I can still look back and go, oh, gee, I wish I had known that, or wish I, hadn't believed that to be true. So it certainly is a process. And, my hope in doing even things like we're doing today is raising this as a topic so people think about it, because the problems that we're seeing in schools, again, that goes upstream. When we look at restraint, seclusion, suspension, expulsion, corporal punishment, the kids that this is happening to are very often children with disabilities, very often Black and brown children, very
Yes.
often very young children,
Young
very
children.
often children with a trauma history already.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, by going through these things that they go through, it's further traumatizing. We're setting children up that have already sometimes, and I would say there's a huge intersection. In fact, one of my colleagues and I, Gail Quigley, who I see on the call here, she's in Australia and has been looking at the intersection of disability and trauma. And I believe there's a huge intersection there.
I agree.
Especially as you look at things, I think about things like autism. My son is autistic. If you think about having communication differences, imagine the trauma, the frustration, looking at stories of children that are non-speaking and the things that have happened to them.
Yes.
So there's a lot of progress to be made for sure. But a lot of the things that we're doing are not only not helping the problem, they're making things worse. So while those things have to stop, we also have to get that focus upstream and figure out how to better support the parents and families.
I agree 100%. And that's, and that isn't necessarily an active part of ATN's mission. Ours is more of the healing once the trauma has occurred, but we talk about it a lot. We talk about what can happen because an adult who has unhealed trauma and has, and does not have healthy attachment styles it's going to be so much harder for them to parent. I mean, they have to work so much harder at that because they have to work on healing and addressing their own triggers and their own things. And the same way with going into any helping profession. If you're a teacher, you're going to have to work on you enough that you can remain emotionally healthy and emotionally available to your children. And that's not an easy thing. It's just not.
Right. And of course, I make this point a lot in the discussions that we have, but you can't have a trauma-informed school, for instance, if you're not taking a trauma-informed approach with your educators, recognizing the trauma that they've been through and supporting them. So, this is where it gets really important. I want to pause for a second and look at some of the questions and comments because I could very easily talk to you for hours and let me get a chance for other people to kind of weigh in here. And I'm just going to read through some of these. This was just a comment from Michelle who said, "Oh my goodness, this is my life. This is also the first time I've heard developmental trauma disorder." So very early on when you were talking about the work of ATN and people coming together had offered that comment. I'm really excited to see my friend and your colleague, Ginger Healy. I had the opportunity, to meet Ginger at Mona de la Hook's presentation here outside of DC, and fantastic. But Ginger said you can join ATN for free and get support, education, and resources. So I do want to mention to people that are watching this, that's a great opportunity to join ATN to learn more about the work that they're doing. One of the things that I've messaged Ginger about a number of times, and she's been really, really helpful, is we have parents that are reaching out to us who have children who have been through traumatic experiences, being restrained or secluded. And I know you have a directory of providers. Ginger's always been great as well as just trying to connect us. But that's one of the other things that you offer there, right?
We do. We have a directory of providers who are trauma informed and attachment focused, and we're building it. We have 300 resources in it at this point. We'd love to have 3,000 resources. So if you know of therapists and other professionals, we have doctors and educators and all kinds of consultants. If you're having, if you're IEP consultants, whatever it is that you're having, sending that information to us so that we can reach out to those folks. We're trying. It's a fairly new directory. We used to just keep like spreadsheets and lists, and we were able to get it funded to be automated. So we're updating the whole thing, and we really, it's available to everybody through our website.
That's an immensely valuable resource.
Yes, it's something I wish I'd have had 20 years ago, right?
Absolutely. I can't tell you the number of conversations I've had, with parents, and one of the recommendations, of course, that we'll often make is, that you need to really understand what has happened and that this has been traumatic. And people sometimes think when there's no visible scars or injuries that everything is fine, but it's not. I mean, the trauma that can be caused. So, and
if your child has a neurodiverse diagnosis anyway, sometimes it's really hard to recognize that it's not going to manifest in typical ways. And so you have to get somebody who really has that experience to help you.
Absolutely. So I'm going to bring up, this is a rather long question, so it's going to block us out here for a second. But Darlene said being separated from a biological parent is very traumatic. It is so traumatic that it's one of the worst things for a child. It seems like state agencies don't understand this and often separate parents from children due to poverty. What are you doing to reduce childhood separations and educating children's services and ICE? All those government authorities separate kids, which have devastating effects. We are bound to a child at a cellular level, was biological parents. So, I guess, again, I know that your work focuses around certain things. Certainly awareness is a big part of this. Do you have any role in working with state agencies or providing, training or other things that might be helpful in getting more recognition in those areas?
We have done some in the past. It's not a huge part of our focus. We do, we do attempt to try to, make a way to train wherever we're asked. So we probably have done more with CASAs and the CASA workers and the GALs in states than directly with the state agencies themselves. My understanding that the recent legislation has really put the funding has really put an emphasis on funding in child welfare to the reunification piece. And because, with the idea that would include supporting the reunification and supporting the family therapeutically and working towards that. Some states are more progressive about that and acting upon that than others. She's right. It is it's a lot of times children are separated from their parents by our state systems in ways that they shouldn't be, that with the right supports and the right education and access to resources, the family could remain together. Obviously in an unsafe situation where a child is being abused or neglected, absolutely not. But that's not always the case. And I've seen it, I've heard it, I've witnessed it firsthand, and it's sad. It definitely is
Absolutely.
a lifelong wound for those children.
Yeah, and I'm sure there are some organizations out there really focused on this as well, more specifically.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah. A couple other comments here. Gail Quigley, who is one of our volunteers in Australia, said, love Dr. Bruce Perry's work, regulate, relate, restore, and I add repair. I have a question here from MJ Jones. How do you get an educator or an IEP team to implement regulation in an IEP? And maybe even more generally, do you have any thoughts or advice on getting people to kind of understand that concept and why it's so important?
That is a really good question. The IEP teams, I heard from somebody yesterday that their IEP team actually talked about the child's dysregulation. So that's an exciting thing, right? The IEP teams that I've been familiar with a lot of times have to understand it through a sensory lens in some ways, sometimes OTs can be a fantastic ally for you, maybe or maybe not, depending on what that looks like in your school system, because a lot of times they don't allow the OTs to get very far down that sensory path, but sometimes they do, because and thank goodness, the folks on the trauma side of things have the folks on the autism, the advocates on the autism side of things to thank for that push, to ask for sensory evaluations, because a lot of times those sensory tools are really helpful in becoming regulating tools, right?
Absolutely.
To the movement and the tactile and the weighted things and all of the things that could be used for other reasons and for other sensory reasons are also regulating. It can be really hard. That's why, we love for people to get educators to get involved with us, both in our educator think tank, which is part of what we provide free on the educator side of things, but also in our conference, so that they can explore some of those ideas and find out what that what that is. There is a lot on our website in terms of there's a infographic that families can take to schools about the impact of trauma on all kinds of domains, on their behaviors, but also on their their cognition and their relationship building skills and all of the things that trauma does impact. And sometimes it helps professionals to see that it's not just a parent telling them this, but that there's science behind all of that. And that's available for download as well, to help with that.
Absolutely. Yeah, it makes me think, you mentioned kind of, well, it's great to see them mentioning regulation, in the IEP team. The flip side of that, though, is that we sometimes hear from schools some really really bad thoughts in terms of regulation. For instance, kids are put in seclusion rooms under the guise it's going to help them regulate, and there's absolutely nothing regulating about being put into a room against your will and having the door held shut.
Right.
And people don't even understand that sometimes the child that comes out 15 minutes later that seems calm is not calm. They're in a dissociative state. Their brain has gone into a survival mode. So there's a lot of, certainly through ATN, you work with a lot of educators that are at the forefront of this, but there are a lot of people that are still fairly far behind. And there seems to be even a blind spot around school-based trauma. We and this is something I've been saying a lot lately, is we can't have a trauma-informed school if we're in fact causing trauma.
Right.
You can't have a trauma-informed program and be putting kids in seclusion rooms. The two things don't reconcile, and people often within schools underestimate the impact of school-based trauma. A kid is thrown, restrained and thrown into a seclusion room, and they expect the child to come back the next day to the site of the trauma and
exactly.
re-engage. So there's certainly a lot of work to be done. It's great to, it's great when you begin to see some of the words, being used, but at the same time, there's such a big difference between people that are really leading the pack here and people that are following a lot of the, a lot of what I would say are kind of outdated approaches. I mean, a lot of our schools are very, very steeped in behaviorism. It's very steeped in kind of the work of, Skinner or Piaget or others about, operant conditioning, and it's about reward and consequence. And, unfortunately, that doesn't work for the kids that most need help.
Right. Exactly. Exactly. Yeah. Well, and it didn't work for my daughter. It didn't work in our situation. One of the things that came up for me as you were talking about that is that, there were two things. First, and I don't mean this in a sassy way, but it may sound sassy, but why would I, as an adult, think that somebody like forcing me into a seclusion room and putting me in a and making me stay in there when I am incredibly upset. Imagine the most upset I've ever been. And I can't calm myself down. Otherwise I would have calmed if I could do it, I would have done it for you before, and I couldn't do it. How do you think that's going to be regulating? Because that's usually not, some adults, some of us do withdraw in order to regulate ourselves, but a lot of times we're seeking a relationship. We're going to call somebody. We're going to call our girlfriend or a mom or a spouse, somebody, and talk through this. And here we're doing something to children that we would be appalled if somebody did it to us, right? It would seem like we were being imprisoned, and definitely that's exactly what's happening. So that was the first thing that came up for me. And then the second thing, as you were talking, is that as a parent, I needed, back in the olden days, I needed permission to keep my child safe and not send them back into that situation. I was, because the system was operating the way it was operating, and I trusted the system because I had no reason not to, right? I just kept sending her to school when when things were happening there that were not safe. And in hindsight, that's probably one of my bigger regrets, is that I didn't, even though I knew a lot of things, I didn't stop it sooner and didn't say, hey, this is, because we assume school's a safe place, and we assume that everybody knows what they're doing. And we want it to work that way.
Right.
And so, it's okay if you have to say no and say, this isn't working out and we've got to back off and my child needs these things until we're able to provide a safer environment here, even if that's a stop
Absolutely.
of.
Yeah. I can't even imagine the number of people I've talked to that have gone through that same thought process of, well, I
Yeah.
should have done something differently, or, but we are one, I think we're conditioned to respond to authority.
Hmm.
We are conditioned then when the doctor or the teacher or someone in a position, a professional position tells us something, we're kind of conditioned to say, okay, well, they're the professional, and well, maybe this doesn't sound right to me, but they would know. And I think, again, there's a lot of fantastic, amazing professionals out there
There
that are
are.
doing amazing things, but there are still people out there that are really following outdated ideas and ideology, and it's a matter of training, it's a matter of culture. Certainly don't blame people that are doing things that they think are
Hmm.
are reasonable or helpful.
Right.
Uh,
Yeah.
and
I don't think even the teachers that were involved in my daughter's situation, I don't think anybody was maliciously
right,
trying to
right,
do anything wrong.
right.
And
Yeah,
and yet that was for me one of the biggest woundings for me as a parent. And one of the most wonderful things for me about our conference is meeting the hundreds and now
mhm, mhm.
thousands of educators who are spearheading this work, because
Absolutely.
they've seen how things went down and what didn't work too, and they've known how many children they couldn't reach through their behaviorism and their other ways, and they're
Right.
like, we've got to make this information known. And
Absolutely.
that gets me out of bed every morning knowing that those
Absolutely.
people are
Yeah.
out there.
Yeah, no, and we have, our audience is pretty diverse at the Alliance. We have parents of kids that have been restrained and secluded. We have self-advocates, autistic self-advocates who have themselves been restrained and secluded. But we also have teachers, administrators, attorneys, related professionals, all people that have kind of come to the same conclusion that we have, which is we can do better. There are better things that we
Mhm.
can do to support people. Well, let me get to a couple more things. I know we're gonna try to wrap this up around 4:30 today. So let me try to get to a couple more questions and comments here. And I haven't even got to probably a quarter of my list. So that just means I have to have you back to have more
Okay.
discussion.
Yeah, sure.
I have one here from Gail again. I'm interested to know how many of the parents you work with have suffered trauma themselves and therefore have trouble making an attachment to their children.
I don't know that I know exactly, how many, because we aren't providing like direct therapy with them, so we wouldn't
Mm,
necessarily know. But I would say that it very much follows the ACEs work to say that probably 40% of us have a lot of work to do. And the tougher our children's behaviors are because of their trauma, the more we need to go do our own work. Is what what's been my experience, because I didn't think I had any work to do. And
mm,
yet the farther along we got in trying to help my daughter heal, the more, you know, the more good questions came up as to why am I overreacting to this particular situation, or this thing that she does, or this way that, that this is happening, but my husband isn't. Well, it was because of my background. And then the reverse would be true for him, right?
mm,
And so we are highly, we always advise parents that they need to look at their own work, and that they also need to think about working on their marriage, because in families of children with significant trauma, that, the rest of the family unit is at risk,
mm,
of,
mhm, mhm.
if they're children that are in the family through adoption or foster, that puts an extra strain. If they're not, if it's a biological situation and there's other, it's even a bigger strain, because a lot of
Absolutely.
times you don't have those resources around
Mhm,
you, and you've
mhm.
got to take care of yourselves.
Absolutely. Julia said, my son was completely hypervigilant after school failures. Took him out of school. His PTSD took approximately 12 months to reduce. Kind of a statement there, but I'm going to piggyback a question on it. And Bruce Perry's in my head right now, but I'm going to ask you the question and get your thoughts. And that is, um, let's talk about hope for a second. Let's talk about healing. Let's talk about,
Hmm.
a parent out there who has had a child that has been through trauma, regardless of the source, whether it was at school, whether it was
Hmm.
result of, adoption or whatever it may be. what is the key, and the key may be the wrong way to put it, but what are things that people can do to help support individuals that have been traumatized and to help them heal?
That obviously the relationships are hugely important, to build relationships every way that you possibly can. Perry's book is it's not necessarily a healing map, but it's got a lot of good guide points. It talks about allowing the person to lead a little bit in that trauma with all of the dosing information that he gives, and all of those types of examples that he gives. That it's the healing timeline is individual for each person in terms of how they heal, and is ongoing for a lot of our children if things have been significant and chronic and early. The earlier, the harder that it's going to be. And it's and part of what we do with parents is we talk to them about adjusting their own expectations around all of this, right? And what does healing look like? It may not look, it may leave scars and not look like it never happened, because it can't look that way. So, and then the same thing on the attachment side of things. And some researchers are showing that if you build strong attachments and you work on relationships as part of that, as part of that traumatic healing, then you get what's called in attachment language an earned secure attachment style and strategy. And they think that may even be stronger. It may even be more resilient than somebody who didn't go through any adversity at all, because you're able to get to, and there's other research that sort of complements that out there in that whole post-traumatic growth realm of research that's happening. And so, the neuroscience, all of that is still trying to quantify that hope. But the truth is, you're stronger if you're able to have survived that and persevered and healed emotionally and built the resilience, because now you have a wider bandwidth of resilience to go through. So if it takes 12 months, if it takes 5 years, whatever it takes, let's do it, because it's worth it, and it makes us stronger for doing it.
Absolutely. And you just got a resounding yes from
Yay, Ginger.
Ginger. Also, Jennifer said healing is possible and it's lifelong, and it's founded in those relationships. I mean, I think of Bruce Perry from that perspective of the importance of even one strong relationship and how much value it can have. Following up from Julia, she said, let's see, I trusted it was safe for him. It wasn't, so I kept him home. For P6 and P7, should have gone with my gut. Somebody else said something very similar here about trusting their gut, and I think that's important. I mean, I think as a parent, being able to if it doesn't feel right, it doesn't sound right, question it. Do your research. And Julia also mentioned that that they're from Northern Ireland and have had generational trauma through being in a war zone. So there's so many different examples out there.
That makes it harder, but it also makes it more important, Julia, that you and your son take those steps, because you can stop it.
Meg said, we're conditioned to keep sending our children to the wrong environment. I wish I had realized earlier. And again, I want to remind people not to, not to beat yourself up.
No.
I know it's really difficult, and we have healing to do as well. The trauma of having a child that's in an environment that's harmful or damaging to them is traumatic on us as parents and caregivers as well. So we need to be mindful of our own trauma and helping our children heal. And part of that is realizing that you are not to blame, for these things that may have happened. Now, Julie, I know we are getting at about time, so I want to be mindful of that, because I know you have a special event to go to after this. So we had a couple more questions, but maybe I'll follow up with you on some of those. I want to thank everybody that's joined us today. Julie, this has been fantastic, and I love the work that you're doing. I wonder if you could, as we close here, tell us a little bit more about the upcoming conference, because I know you've got an amazing, series of guests for that. So you could tell us a little bit more about the conference, and if you have any other closing thoughts, that would be great.
Sure. Okay. So this will be our 5th annual Creating Trauma Sensitive Schools conference. We are going to do it both in person and virtual. We did the virtual last year, and we found out that there were rural schools and individual practitioners and parents and others who could attend in that environment much easier than getting on a plane, even if there isn't a pandemic. So we're going to try to focus for both. They have 2 different schedules, so you'll see different people there, except we will be filming some of the main stage people in Houston for the virtual. It's February 20th through 25th, and the in-person is 20 through 22, and then Thursday and Friday will be the virtual. Our keynotes, our in-person keynotes are the Secretary of Education, who it looks like we've got about a 98% chance he's going to be there. I'll know next week for sure.
Yeah.
So very excited about that. And Dr. Fania Davis, who is a restorative practices and restorative justice expert and an advocate for justice and children and all, we're excited for her. On the virtual side, we're going to have Dr. Stephen Porges, the creator of the polyvagal theory, as our Thursday keynote. And on Friday, Amelia Nagoski is her name. She and her sister Emily wrote a book called Burnout, and it's an incredible book about burnout, about what happens in our brains when we burn out and what we can do about it. And it's really going to be applicable to teachers right now, because this has been one of the hardest school years ever. So you can attend either or both. The virtual, of course, will be recorded and offered for the next 90 days. We have all kinds of other things involved in this conference. We have a community service project where we're making comm kits for the schools in Houston, and all kinds of good things that we want the teachers to be involved with. But we'd love to have you. You can learn more on our website, attachtrauma.org/conference.
And I just put that link in the chat as well.
Awesome.
And I'm excited to say that I'll be attending.
You are going to be there
and presenting as well. So I'm really excited to see you there. Not too long. I need to start working on my presentation.
Yeah, get that airline ticket. Gotta get
Absolutely. There. Hey, Julie, it's been a pleasure to talk to you again, and I appreciate you joining us today. I know I promised to get you out of here at 4:30. We're 1 minute behind, but thank you so much for joining us, and I look forward to talking to you again soon, and would love to have you back.
You're welcome. Thank you, Guy. I appreciate all the work you're doing, and thanks to all of your folks out there.
Absolutely. Thank you, Julie. So for those of you that are still here, I just wanted to share with you a couple of quick announcements. One is that we have another presentation coming up again in 2 weeks. So, thank you for joining us today. But guess what? We've got more great stuff coming very soon. In fact, let me tell you a little bit about what we have coming up next time. Next time we have a guest, Dr. Erin Hambrick. Dr. Erin Hambrick actually works with Dr. Bruce Perry. And Dr. Hambrick is going to be talking about the neurosequential model, which is the model that was developed with through the neurosequential network and Bruce Perry's work, about how to improve the lives of children, families, and their communities. So definitely another not miss event. You'll want to make sure that you tune in for that. And with that, I want to thank everybody for joining us today. It's always a pleasure to do these. I really appreciate everybody that was able to join us and watch this event live. As always, if you have questions or comments, feel free to reach out to us. If you have guest ideas, we're always looking for more guests to highlight here in these presentations. So until next time, thank you so much, and I look forward to seeing you again soon. Bye-bye.